Have you ever wondered about quote-unquote deathbed conversions? I mean, I'm not talking about the person who lives their entire life trying to serve God, trying to do what they believe to be right and everything, and then they suddenly, toward the end of their life, they discover, oh, I've never been immersed in water for the forgiveness of my sins. And so they are immersed and they live a few more days and then they're gone. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the person who lives a life openly hostile toward God. That they would curse God to His face. They would spit in God's face if they could. That they just couldn't care any less about God. But then one day, they have a heart attack. And it kind of shakes them to their core. They have surgery, bypasses are done, and they get out of the hospital and they begin to study, and they come to the conclusion that, oh, wow, God is real. And I need to obey Him. And they obey the gospel, and they're baptized in water for the forgiveness of their sins. They're brought up, and then a few days later, they have another massive heart attack and they're gone. You know, you think about stories like that, and it just doesn't seem fair, does it? I mean, there are some of us who live our entire lives going to church and serving God and doing the best that we can. And it's hard to live that way. And then somebody lives the way they want to live all of their life until the very end. And then they get the same reward that we do. And then we also think of classics of literature like Dante's Inferno, with the varying degrees of in hell and everything, depending on how bad you were, is the level of punishment that you get. And maybe in the back of our minds we think, it would just be a lot more fair if heaven were like that. You know, if you just barely get there at the end, then you know, you have some joy, but if you serve God all of your life and everything, then you just get that top level of joy. Well, tonight I want us to look at a parable about fairness or unfairness, depending on how you want to look at it. The parable of the workers in the vineyard, found in Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16, if you want to open your Bibles there. To some, this parable appears to be unfair. I mean, in fact, to some of the characters in the parable, it appears to be unfair. And they say it's unfair. But as we'll see later, it's really not a parable about being unfair at all. It's just not that the landowner was treating anybody unfairly, just that the landowner was very generous with what he had. And he was a nice landowner. Let's look at the story, Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go in the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, why do you stand here all idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled against the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But he replied to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to the last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first last. Now, can you see where somebody might say that this is not fair? I mean, wouldn't you like to have a job where you work for 1 hour and get paid exactly the same as someone who worked 12 hours? Especially if it's a manual labor job. Wouldn't that be great? I mean, yeah, it'd be good for you. The person who worked 12 hours probably wouldn't think it was that wonderful. But you would like it. I mean, that'd be nice for you. And it probably would make a lot of enemies for you, especially those who were working the full day while you only worked an hour and got paid exactly the same. But let's get back to the parable at hand. Let's look first at the background of the parable, and then I think the messages of the parable will become clear to us. So let's look at the background to the parable. To understand the background, first thing we have to understand is the servants. These servants that are mentioned here are ones who lived on the verge of destitution, the edge of destitution. They had a very rigorous daily schedule. The way that it worked was early in the morning, they went to the town square. And they waited. People would come by who were looking for people to work in their fields and so forth, and some would get hired, some would not get hired. And you really wanted to be hired because that was your job. You didn't have any other job to do. You didn't get paid a salary for something. No, that was what you did. If you didn't get hired, you didn't eat. Bottom line. So you wait for work, and if work came, then you went to work. If it didn't, then you didn't. And the daily pay is also significant. You were hired for the day. And typically what you were paid was a denarius. A denarius was the day's wage for a daily laborer. And that wage, that denarius, had to be paid that day. Now, it sounds like that just makes good business sense because you're hiring somebody for the day, you pay them at the end of the day. And it does make good business sense, but there was more to it in the Jewish society, in the Jewish culture. You see, it wasn't just a business thing, it was the law. Not the law of the land, it was the law of God. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13, they are told, do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. In other words, pay him that night. Deuteronomy 24, verse 15 says, pay him his wages each day before sunset because he is poor and counting on it. Otherwise he may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. So when you hired somebody to work for you for the day, let's say that you hired somebody for the day, and then you said, hey, I kind of like you, I want you to come back tomorrow. And actually, I'll have work for you every day this week, and then I'll pay you at the end of the week. You couldn't do that. You had to pay them at the end of each day. Now, so the servants give us a little bit of background to what they were and how they lived their lives. The story is also important because the story is a true scenario around harvest time, specifically around the grape harvest time. You see, that would be the end of August through early September, would be when the grapes would be harvested. And you see, around the middle of September, the rains started to come. And you wanted to have your field harvested before the first real downpour. Because if you didn't, any product that was still in the field was gone. Okay? Because of not getting it harvested in time. So this was a very true scenario that probably did happen around the harvest. I mean, in fact, when the rains started to come, and when you could look up and you knew it was getting close to the middle of September, you knew that the clouds were on the horizon and everything, it would be very prudent of landowners to go to the town square several times during the day and hire additional people just to make sure that they got the harvest in. That was so very important. even as late as 5 p.m. See, the Jewish workday was from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So this landowner hired people at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m., 4 and 5 p.m. And then he paid everyone exactly the same. So what's the message of the parable? What's the parable really about? Is it about, if somebody tries to get you to do something or whatever, and all that, if you hold back long enough, eventually they'll come and you only have to work for 1 hour instead of 12 hours and get the same result, and you're playing it smart that way? No. That's not the message. Okay, the message, actually, there are 4 of them at least that I came up with. The first has to do with quality versus quantity. This actually was a very common lesson of Jewish rabbis. Those hired at 6 a.m. did a lot of work. A lot of work. The heat of the day and everything, they did a lot of work. Those were hired at 5 p.m., the ones hired last, did comparatively little work. I don't know if their work was any better. It may have been, at least for that last hour, because they'd been sitting idle all day. And then they come and they had all this energy and everything. The ones hired first would have to pace themselves because they didn't want to give out partway through the day. They would have to do work in at a pace that they could keep up the entire day. Whereas these others just had an hour to work, so they could have put everything into it. The message being, a comparatively small piece of work done with care and diligence is better than a great amount of work done in a sloppy way. And again, that was a common message of rabbis, to not just that they were encouraging people to just do a little bit of work really well, they were encouraging them to do everything very well. An author is not necessarily judged by the number of books that he or she writes, but by the quality of the books that they write. There are some authors who have written volumes of works that are forgotten because they were second rate, because they weren't that good, because they were just words put down on paper and didn't really impact anyone or anything. Other authors have written one, but it was a masterpiece. People like Anna Sewell, Black Beauty. It's the only thing that she wrote that anybody knows that she wrote. Or Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind. That's about it. That's all that we know that she wrote. And that's the lesson: quality versus quantity. Sometimes it's better to do a little bit very well than it is to do a lot substandardly. Another message of the parable is Jews versus Gentiles. See, the Jews had always been the chosen nation of God. They had always had the advantage as far as God was concerned. And Jesus here is maybe saying that the Gentiles are going to get the same reward. Now, if you were a Jew and Jesus said that or implied that in this lesson, how do you suppose the Jews would respond to that? They wouldn't like it very much, would they? It would infuriate them. Yet that's what Jesus could be saying here. The Jews looked on God as only a judge and lawgiver. That God gave the law, and if you didn't follow the law, and the Gentiles can't follow the law, then, that was it. That God would dish out exactly as they deserved. For their years of quote-unquote faithful service as God's chosen people, the Jews would get rewarded. And for the Gentiles, simply because they were Gentiles, they were going to be punished. And that's how the Jews saw God. But God is not just a judge and lawgiver. God is also a father. A father doesn't love his eldest child more than he loves his youngest child. Love doesn't have degrees. It is equal. Now, there are different types of love, And those types of love are expressed in different ways. But there's no degrees within the types of love. It's kind of like blood type, okay? If you don't have a blood type that is 50% AB negative, 10% O positive, and the other 40% is AB positive. It doesn't work that way. You have one blood type, just one, and it goes all through your veins. So quality versus quantity. Jews versus Gentiles. Another message of the parable has to do with sooner versus later. Whenever we come to God, He accepts us. Plain and simple. It doesn't matter if you were raised in the church, you were baptized when you were 12 years old, and you faithfully served God until you turn 90 years old, and then you die and you receive your reward. That's wonderful. That's great. But by the same token, it doesn't matter if you live your entire life for yourself and when you're 90 years old, discover God and Christ and His sacrifice for your sins and are baptized, and the next day you die. It doesn't matter. Sooner versus later. Whenever we come to God, He accepts us. He knows our heart, and He knows what is going on. It's sort of like a family. In fact, it's exactly like a family. Christmas wasn't that long ago, was it? I know it's almost already February, but Christmas wasn't all that long ago. We went to San Antonio for Christmas. For Christmas, my mom gave all of us presents. For those adult children, we got pictures of dead presidents. Great gift, okay? But I found it curious that Monica received exactly the same number of dead presidents as I did. But I have been in the family for 22 years, 8 months, and 14 days longer than she has. But she got the same thing. Didn't matter. If you're in the family, you get the same amount. Don't even start with the grandkids, though, okay? They've been in the family a lot shorter time than me, and, anyway. That's another story for another time. But the point is, sooner versus later. It didn't matter when somebody got into the family, they're in the family. And they get the same benefits and privileges of being in the family. Then finally, best versus less than the best. There's still yet another lesson in the parable. We're told in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart, as working for the Lord and not for men. When we work, we need to remember that whatever we're doing for God. If you're a school teacher, you teach for the school district, you teach for the school, you teach for the kids, and you teach for God. Plain and simple. If you're a plumber, you wade through unspeakable things for your company, for your boss, for the client that you're servicing and helping. But you work also for God. If you're an accountant, same thing. You work for the firm that you work for the boss, but you work for the boss as well. And, we could go on and on with every occupation that we know. Even that whole being retired thing. When you retire from your physical work, it doesn't mean that you've retired from your spiritual work. You still have to work for the Lord. You still have to be engaged in His business. We work for God. He deserves our very best. Whatever we're doing for God, and we want Him to be pleased. We want Him to be proud. George Eliot, in her poem on Antonio Stradivari, the maker of the famous Stradivarius violins, describes how Antonio felt that while God gave the great musicians music, he gave them the violins to play. And then a thought comes to Antonio. If my hand slacked, I should rob God. He could not make Antonio Stradivari's violins without Antonio. He was working for God. And anyone can take that same attitude. You might be a car salesman. And you might be selling cars, but you're not just selling cars for the company you work for, you're selling cars for God. You might be a woodworker, but you're not just carving things out of wood for the person that wants you to make something for them. You're doing it for God. For God could not do whatever it is that you do without you. And we have to understand and realize that. We need to be doing the best job we can no matter what we are doing. When we're at work, we need to be the best electrician, the best student, the best volunteer, the best whatever that we can be. Not because we want people to look at us and say, "Oh, you're such a good person." We do it so that it brings glory to God. That's our focus. That's our point. And we do it regardless of how others may work. You know, some people may slack off and say, "I'm not going to do too much here. I mean, you know what? I'm getting paid by the hour. And if I take a little bit longer, then I get more money." Instead of doing their best, they don't work as good as they should or could. That's not the way that we do things. We should approach working for God the same way. When we assemble for the purposes of worshiping, we need to give God the best that we have. I'm not talking about money. I'm not talking about clothing. I'm talking about time. When we assemble, when we gather together, what's happening right here ought to be first, foremost, and solely on our minds. We ought to be giving our best time to God. Too often we start to let our minds wander a bit. You know, we think about other things we have on our plate. Think about what we're going to be doing afterwards. Think about, when is that guy going to be finished? I mean, he's at the end of his outline. He needs to be done, right? Maybe we start making a to-do list about what we've got going on afterwards. And then we leave. And we wonder why church was so uninteresting to us. Maybe it was uninteresting because we weren't giving our best. So we need to give our best when we come together. And we might find that services are a lot more meaningful and a lot more beneficial to us. So how about you? How long have you been working in the vineyard of the Lord? How long have you been working for Him? It really doesn't matter. Because the point is that for as long as you've been working for Him, you've got to work even longer until the time comes when you're called home or when Jesus comes back. You've got to be faithfully serving. You've got to be faithfully working in that vineyard. Faithfully harvesting in that vineyard. How long has it been since you planted seeds in that vineyard? Those seeds are those things that you do with people who aren't Christians, who you know. Maybe people that you work with or that you see daily or every so often. How long since you planted a seed of the gospel in their lives? See, working in the vineyard isn't just about the harvest, it's about working. It's about planting seed. It's about watering, caring for, tending seed. And it's about harvesting as well. If our congregation is going to grow, we've got to start planting seeds in the vineyard of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. If If our congregation is going to grow, we need to start taking care of those seeds that we plant in the vineyard of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. We need to start working toward a harvest of those seeds in the vineyard of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. How active are we willing to be in working in the vineyard of the Lord? This evening, if you're subject to the invitation of Jesus and you need to make a public response to have that need met, why don't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together.